and easy life they had left behind. The bearers, heavy laden as they were, proceeded at a steady pace that taxed the strength of the girls to keep up with after the first few miles were passed. The heat of the sun was intense. The country after a short distance had been passed became barren and desolate. They did not suffer from thirst, for an ample supply of fruit was carried by one of the bearers, but their limbs ached, and their feet, unused to walking, became tender and painful. "Can we not stop for a while, Jethro?" Mysa asked beseechingly. Jethro shook his head. "We must keep on to the wells. They are 2 hours further yet. They told us at starting that the first day's journey was 6 hours steady walking." Mysa was about to say that she could walk no further, when Ruth whispered in her ear: "We must not give way, Mysa. You know we promised that if they would take us with them, we would go through all difficulties and dangers without complaining." The admonition had its effect. Mysa felt ashamed that she had been on the point of giving way on the very first day of their starting on their real journey, and struggled bravely on; but both girls were utterly exhausted by the time they arrived at the wells. They felt rewarded, however, for their sufferings by the hearty commendation Jethro bestowed upon them. "You have held on most bravely," he said, "for I could see you were terribly fatigued. I am afraid you will find it very hard work just at first, but after that it will be more easy to you. Tomorrow's journey is a shorter one." It was well that it was so, for the girls were limping even at the start, and needed the assistance of Jethro and the boys to reach the next halting place, and as soon as the tent, which was separated into two parts by hangings, was erected, they dropped upon their cushions, feeling that they could never get through another day's suffering like that they had just passed. Jethro saw that this was so, and told their escort that he must halt next day, for that his young sons had been so long in the boat that the fatigue had quite overcome them. He accompanied the intimation with a present to each of the four men. They offered no objections, while the porters, who were paid by the day, were well contented with the halt. The day's rest greatly benefited the girls, but it was not long enough to be of any utility to their feet. These, however, they wrapped in bandages, and started in good spirits when the porters took up the loads. They were now following the course of what in wet weather was a stream in the mountains. Sometimes the hills on either side receded a little, at others they rose almost perpendicularly on either side of the stream, and they had to pick their way among great boulders and rocks. This sort of walking, however, tired the girls less than progressing along a level. Their feet were painful, but the soft bandages in which they were enveloped hurt them far less than the sandals in which they had at first walked, and they arrived at the halting place in much better condition than on the previous occasions. "The worst is over now," Jethro said to them encouragingly. "You will find each day's work come easier to you. You have stood it far better than I expected, and I feel more hopeful now that we shall reach the end of our journey in safety than I have done since the evening when I first agreed to take you with us." While passing through some of the ravines the party had been greatly amused by the antics of troops of apes. Sometimes these sat tranquilly on the hillside, the elder gravely surveying the little caravan, the younger frisking about perfectly unconcerned. Sometimes they would accompany them for a considerable distance, making their way along the rough stones of the hillside at a deliberate pace, but yet keeping up with the footmen below. As the ape was a sacred animal in Egypt, Mysa was gladdened by their sight, and considered it a good omen for the success of their journey. The men who escorted them told them that if undisturbed the apes never attack travelers, but if molested they would at once attack in a body, with such a fury that even 4 or 5 travelers together would have but little chance of escape with their lives. During the first week's journey they saw no other animals, although at night they heard the cries of hyenas, who often came close up to the encampment, and once or twice a deep roar which their guide told them was that of a lion. On the 7th day, however, soon after they had started upon their march, the sound of breaking branches was heard among some trees a short distance up the hillside, and immediately afterward the heads of 4 or 5 great beasts could be seen above the mimosa bushes which extended from the wood to the bottom of the hill. The bearers gave a cry of terror, and throwing down their loads took to their heels. The 4 men of the escort stood irresolute. Although none of Jethro's party had ever before seen an elephant, they knew from pictures and carvings, and from the great statues in the island of Elephanta, what these great creatures were. "Will they attack us?" Jethro asked the men. "They do not often do so," one of them replied, "although at times they come down and waste the fields round villages, and will sometimes slay any they come across. But it is best to get out of their way." Jethro pointed out a few of the more valuable packages, and taking these up they entered the bushes on the other slope of the hill and made their way among them as far as they could. This was, however, but a short distance, for they were full of sharp thorns and offered terrible obstacles to passage. All of the party received severe scratches, and their garments suffered much, in making their way but 20 yards into the bush. "That will do," Jethro said. "We shall be torn to pieces if we go further, and we are as much concealed from sight here as we should be another 100 yards further. I will see what they are doing." Standing up and looking cautiously through the screen of feathery leaves, Jethro saw that the elephants were standing immovable. Their great ears were erected and their trunks outstretched as if scenting the air. After 2 or 3 minutes' hesitation they continued to descend the hill. "Are they afraid of man?" Jethro asked one of the escort. "Sometimes they are seized with a panic and fly at the approach of a human being, but if attacked they will charge any number without hesitation." "Do you ever hunt them?" "Sometimes, but always with a great number of men. It is useless to shoot arrows at them, the only way is to crawl out behind and cut the back sinews of their legs. It needs a strong man and a sharp sword, but it can be done. Then they are helpless, but even then it is a long work to dispatch them. Generally we drive them from our villages by lighting great fires and making noises. Solitary elephants are more dangerous than a herd. I have known one of them kill a dozen men, seizing some in his trunk and throwing them in the air as high as the top of a lofty tree, dashing others to the ground and kneeling upon them until every bone is crushed to pieces." The elephants had now reached the bottom of the valley, and the chief of the escort held up his hand for perfect silence. All were prepared to fight if the elephants pursued them into the bushes, for further retreat was impossible. Amuba and Chebron had fitted their arrows into the bowstrings and loosened their swords in the scabbards. The 4 natives had drawn the short heavy swords they carried, while Jethro grasped the axe that was his favorite weapon. "Remember," he had whispered to the boys, "the back sinews of the legs are the only useful point to aim at. If they advance, separate, and if they make toward the girls try to get behind them and hamstring them." There was a long pause of expectation. The elephants could be heard making a low snorting noise with their trunks, and Jethro at last raised himself sufficiently to look through the bushes at what was going on. The elephants were examining the bundles that had been thrown down. "I believe that they are eating up our food," he whispered as he sat down again. Half an hour elapsed, and then there was a sound of breaking the bushes. Jethro again looked out. "Thank the gods!" he exclaimed. "They are going off again." Trampling down the mimosa thicket as if it had been grass, the elephants ascended the opposite hill and at last re entered the wood from which they had first emerged. The fugitives waited for a quarter of an hour and then made their way out again from the thicket, Jethro cutting a path with his axe through the thorns. An exclamation of surprise broke from them as they gained the open ground. The whole of their stores were tossed about in the wildest confusion. Every one of the packages had been opened. Tents, garments, and carpets hung upon the bushes as if the animals had tossed them contemptuously there, as being unfit to eat. Everything eatable had disappeared. The fruit, grain, and vegetables had been completely cleared up. The skins of wine were bursted, but the contents had been apparently appreciated, for none remained in the hollows of the rocks. "What greedy creatures!" Mysa exclaimed indignantly. "They have not left us a single thing." "They do not often get a chance of such dainty feeding," Amuba said. "I don't think we ought to blame them, especially as they do not seem to have done very much damage to our other goods." "Look how they have trampled down the bushes as they went through. I wish their skins were as thin as mine," Mysa said as she wiped away the blood from a deep scratch on her cheek. "They would keep up in their own woods then and not come down to rob travelers." "At any rate, Mysa, we ought to feel indebted to them," Chebron said, "for not having pushed their investigations further. We should have had no chance either of escape or resistance in these bushes. Jethro told us to move round and attack them from behind; but moving round in these thorns is all very well to talk about, but quite impossible to do. 2 minutes of active exercise and there would not be a morsel of flesh left